Hello and welcome to another Shek TV video. This one will be on the Grand Renaissance Dam or GERD, which is being built in Ethiopia, and upon completion will be the largest in Africa and the seventh in the world, with a production capacity of over 6,000 megawatts. While it's being hailed by Ethiopia as a game changer in its electricity needs, the other downstream countries of Sudan and Egypt sees it as an attempt by Ethiopia to deny them the much needed water for their population's own use. This is causing some political strain between Ethiopia and Egypt and might cause a water war between the two nations. We will try to explain some of these issues in this video. So, before we get into the details of the dam controversies, let us give you a background of some of these issues. The Grand Renaissance Dam, otherwise known as the GERD, is being built on the Blue Nile in the Benishangul-Gumuz Region of Ethiopia, approximately 20 kilometers to the border with Sudan. The Blue Nile is the larger of the two tributaries that makes up the Nile River, the other being the White Nile. It begins in Ethiopia's Lake Tana and is responsible for about 85% of the Nile's flow, which is about 84 billion cubic meters of water annually. While the Nile is the longest river in the world, it is very shallow and therefore does not carry a lot of water. For comparison purposes, the Congo, the other big African river, has an output of 1,000 billion cubic meters, about 14 times that of the Nile. However, what it lacks in depth, it gets in length, as it runs through 10 African countries, namely Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, who all rely on it for fresh water to some degree. Historically, most of the Nile water has gone to Egypt, which kind of makes sense given that Egypt is the most water scarce of the 10 countries, and also has the second highest population of the Nile Basin countries. In 1929, the Anglo-Egyptian treaty signed by Britain, which was then the colonial power on most of the Nile countries, guaranteed Egypt and Sudan 48 billion and 4 billion cubic meters of water respectively, out of 84 billion cubic meters available. In 1959, Egypt and an independent Sudan signed a bilateral treaty that increased both countries' share of the Nile waters, giving Egypt 55 billion cubic meters of water and Sudan 18.5 billion cubic meters of water, and also allocated themselves veto power on any upstream development. This agreement didn't leave much water for the other 8 countries, who only had 10 billion cubic meters of water to share amongst themselves, yet most of them were contributing most of the Nile waters. One can argue that the other countries had other sources of water and their population numbers were low, but things have changed, especially in Ethiopia, which has the second highest population in Africa at 110 million people, 10 million more than Egypt. Ethiopia's economy has also grown and demand for power is at an all-time high. In fact, according to data from the World Bank and the IMF, Ethiopia has averaged a 9.5% GDP growth and 7.7% GDP per capita growth, making it the fastest growing economy in the world. Nonetheless, Ethiopia still suffers. It has a per capita water consumption of only 125 million cubic meters of water per year, which is way too low. For context, Egypt has a per capita water consumption of 570 million cubic meters of water per year, and the global average is about 1,000 million cubic meters of water per year. Ethiopia has a national power production capacity of about 4,000 megawatts and a per capita consumption of around 65 kilowatt hours per year. Egypt, on the other hand, has a capacity of 1,510 kilowatt hours per capita power consumption annually. A dam like this could easily solve all these problems for Ethiopia. It guarantees water, electricity, and at full production would make Ethiopia a net exporter of electricity, thereby boosting its foreign currency reserves. Which is why in 2011, Ethiopia announced the construction of the Renaissance Dam. At the time, Hosni Mubarak had just been ousted in Egypt courtesy of the Arab Spring. With the goings on in Egypt, no one really paid any attention to Ethiopia's announcement. But since then, it has become a serious issue. politics aside, the dam is 70% complete. It is 1,800 meters long and 145 meters wide. It is expected to produce 6,500 megawatts of electricity, doubling Ethiopia's current production. The project cost is about $5 billion, including $1.8 billion of Chinese loan. To finance the project, Ethiopia started a state lottery and then took a month of all government workers' salary in 2018 and even issued a patriotic bond. The dam's reservoir is the size of Greater London with a maximum capacity of 67 billion cubic meters of water, and Ethiopia plans to start filling it as early as July 2020. This is not good news for downstream countries, especially Egypt, which relies on the Nile for 90% of its freshwater needs, 85% of which is used for crop water farming. According to some sources, if Ethiopia fills its dam over the next 10 years, this would mean a 14% water decrease in Egypt and 18% of Nile farmland would be destroyed. If filled over 7 years, this would mean a 22% water decrease and a 33% of farmland being destroyed. If it is filled in just 5 years, this would mean a 36% loss of water to Egypt and a 50% of Nile farmland being destroyed. All this explains why Egypt is resistant to any of the plans. It is worth noting that Egypt uses a very inefficient method of crop surface irrigation, which according to some studies causes a high water loss, decline in land productivity, and causes salinity problems. With all this push and pull between the two nations, there is no doubt a conflict is likely. Egypt's insistence on using the 1959 agreement is clearly unfair. Because of this, the 10 Nile Basin countries tried to agree on something new in 1999 when they launched the Nile Basin Initiative with the support of donor partners such as the World Bank. But when the upstream countries proposed a cooperative agreement framework in 2010, which proposed equitable utilization of the Nile resources, Egypt and Sudan demanded veto power on any development upstream. The upstream countries refused, and Egypt and Sudan left the initiative, with Sudan rejoining later. Despite efforts from various actors, including the US for a deal, an agreement is always a long shot. Egypt has gotten used to having the Nile by itself, which means any concession will always be politically difficult. Ethiopia is less likely to make a concession either because of domestic politics and the fact that Sudan has softened its stance a bit, probably because they have been promised cheap electricity by Ethiopia, and secondly, it will help reduce the flooding on the Blue Nile which affects the populations in Sudan. With all these happenings, a lot of people think that this might trigger a water war between these two countries. Let us know what you think about this conflict and whether you think Egypt is being fair to the upstream countries and whether Ethiopia should continue building the dam.